The wind on that train platform wasn't just cold. It was personal. It tore at her thin shawl like it wanted to see the secrets she was hiding underneath. But the woman who called herself Lily didn't even shiver. She stood straight, her boots soaked through from the snow, a single canvas bag clutched in her raw red knuckles. She'd been standing there for a long time, long enough for the whispers to start. The good people of the town gathered in little clumps, their words like puffs of steam in the bitter air. "Is that her?" they'd mutter. "Not what I expected." Then the worst one. "No better than a beggar." Lily heard it all. She felt their eyes on her worn-out dress, the dirt on her hem. She didn't care. The girl they were looking for, the one named Grace Harper, was already dead. Buried back in Kansas under a pile of lies and letters that smelled of cheap whiskey and old blood. This was Lily now. Lily was a survivor. The train hissed its last breath and pulled away, leaving a thick, swirling mist. And out of that mist, a man appeared. He was broad, silent, a dark hat pulled low over his eyes. He walked like he owned the ground his boots fell on, each step a final, unarguable statement. This was him, Colton Hayes. He carried a folded letter in one hand, the same one she'd answered 3 weeks ago, her hands shaking so badly she could barely write her new name. The letter that had promised nothing, no romance, no riches, just a roof, a quiet life, a place at a table. He stopped right in front of her. His eyes were the color of hazel in a winter stream, calm and impossible to read. "You're Lily," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. "And you're Colton," she replied, her voice steady. He gave a single, sharp nod. Then he gestured to a wagon waiting nearby. It was a good wagon, solid, with 2 strong horses already harnessed. There was no driver, no servant, no welcome party, just him. "Let's go," he said. He didn't offer to take her bag. He didn't look twice at her ragged clothes. He just turned his back, expecting her to follow. And for the first time in months, she did exactly what a man expected her to do. She followed him into a new life. Or so she thought. Because the man in front of her was already keeping a secret of his own. The ride to his homestead was long and silent. The wagon wheels crunched over miles of frozen earth, the mountains watching them like silent, white-capped judges. Lily sat beside Colton, the silence stretching between them, thicker than the winter air. She risked a look at him. He didn't look old, but he didn't look young either. There was a hard set to his jaw, a weariness in his sharp eyes. This was a man who didn't build fences to keep things out. He built walls to keep things in. She had to break the silence. "You live alone?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Mostly," he grunted. She tried again. "Why me? Why my letter?" He shrugged, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "You answered." That was it. Just that. No questions about her past, no compliments on her appearance she knew she didn't deserve. He wasn't trying to save her. He was just offering a place. And that was more terrifying than any threat she'd ever faced, because it felt real. The ranch appeared as the sun began to die, bleeding orange and purple across the sky. A tall archway marked the entrance, the name Hayes carved deep into the wood. But beyond it, the land just kept going. Fences stretched to the horizon, wrapping around huge pastures, massive barns, and fields sleeping under a thick blanket of frost. The main house was a 2-story fortress of dark timber and stone. It didn't just look not poor, it looked rich, powerfully rich. "You said you had a small farm," she murmured, the words catching in her throat. Colton didn't even look at her. "I didn't say how small." He drove her past a bunkhouse where a dozen ranch hands stopped to watch them pass. He drove past a smokehouse big enough to feed an army. He drove past rows of hay bales, stacked taller than the house itself. 2 men tipped their hats. From the kitchen porch of the main house, An older woman with a face like carved oak and a dark, tight braid watched them with unblinking eyes. "That's Rosa," Colton said. "She runs the kitchen." Lily felt the woman's gaze like a physical touch. "You trust her?" she asked. Colton's answer was immediate. "With my life." He brought the wagon to a halt and jumped down. He walked around to her side and held out a hand. It wasn't a gentlemanly gesture to help a lady. It was a simple offer of balance. She took it. His hand was calloused and warm, a strange shock against her icy skin. But as he led her toward the house, she realized the truth. He hadn't just lied about the size of the farm. His letter, his promise of a simple life, was a lie too. And she had just walked right into the middle of it. The inside of the house was just as imposing as the outside. It smelled of cedar wood, burning coal, and rich beef stew. The floors were polished to a mirror shine. Everything was clean, ordered, and silent. It was the kind of quiet that comes when no one has raised their voice in years. The parlor was lined wall to wall with books. A violin rested on a shelf. Dried herbs hung in the archway to the kitchen. This wasn't just a ranch house. It was a dynasty. Colton led her upstairs to a guest room. "You can stay here," he said. "Tonight. Longer if you want." He paused at the door. "If you don't, there's a train back east in the morning." She hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. "You didn't ask me why I came." His eyes met hers, and for a second, she saw something flicker in their hazel depths, something knowing. "I figured you'd tell me when you wanted to. Most men don't give a woman that much space," she said, testing him. "Most men don't know what it's like to be cornered," he replied. Then he turned and walked down the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the massive house. She closed the door, and only then did her legs start to shake. She leaned against the cool wood, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury she'd given up long ago. Instead, she slid her bag from her wrist and pulled out the folded packet of letters. Each one was marked with the same ugly, waxy seal. Each one smelled of fear and smoke. Her hands trembled as she held them. She scanned the room. It was simple, clean. A bed, a dresser, a window looking out over the endless snow. But there was no cross on the wall. And no mirror. Good. She knelt down, her fingers searching the floorboards beside the bed. She found a loose one, pried it up with her nails, and slid the packet of letters into the dark space beneath. She pressed the board back into place, smoothing it down until it was invisible. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, pulled off her wet boots, and for the first time in weeks, she whispered her real name to the empty room. Grace Harper. Just once, a ghost saying its own name. Because tomorrow, Lily had to be strong again. Lily had to survive. What she didn't know was that downstairs, Colton Hayes was standing in the dark, listening. And he'd heard everything. Down in his study, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Colton leaned back in his leather chair, the quiet of the house wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. It was a familiar quiet, a lonely quiet he had cultivated for years. He held an empty whiskey glass in his hand, but the bottle on the table was nearly full. He poured the drinks out of habit now, not desire, just something to hold on to, something to weigh him down. Upstairs he could hear her, faint footsteps pacing back and forth in the guest room, light, hesitant steps, like an animal testing the walls of a new cage. He knew that feeling. He knew what it was like to be trapped. He'd been trapped once, right here in this very house. Her name was Vivian Ashford. She had a laugh like breaking glass, and she moved through his home like she was already measuring it for new curtains. She'd wanted his name, his land, his money, but what she'd really wanted was to tear it all down. He'd overheard her one night, talking to her cousin on the porch, her voice dripping with venom. "You think I care about this dusty ranch? Colton's mine. The richest man for 3 counties and dumb enough to think I love him? Watch me." He hadn't confronted her. He hadn't yelled. He just walked back inside, poured a drink, and the next morning, he'd ended it. Sent her packing with nothing but the silk dress on her back. After Vivian, he had gone quiet. Careful. He hadn't so much as looked at another woman in 5 long years. He just worked. Made the ranch bigger, the cattle stronger, the walls around his heart thicker. Until one night, sitting alone, the loneliness finally got to be too much. He'd written that simple, plain letter. "I have a roof, a ranch, and quiet. If you're looking for diamonds, don't answer. If you're looking for a place at the table, write me back." He didn't expect a reply. Not a real one. Then hers came. No picture, just a few lines in a firm, steady hand. "I cook well, I sew better, and I don't ask questions I wouldn't want answered. I'd like to see open sky again." That last line had hooked him. Open sky. Now she was upstairs. A woman named Lily who whispered the name Grace when she thought no one could hear. A woman who hid letters under his floorboards. A woman who was running from something terrible. He didn't know what it was. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let it get her. The next morning, the kitchen was already warm when Rosa came in, and she stopped dead in the doorway. Lily was there, apron tied, sleeves rolled up, chopping potatoes with a speed and precision that was almost military. "You don't have to do that, mija," Rosa said, her voice soft but wary. Lily looked up, startled. "I didn't know what else to do with my hands." Rosa looked at her hands, clean, calloused, capable. "You have good hands," Rosa said. It was both a compliment and a question. They worked in silence for a while, Rosa watching Lily's every move. Not with suspicion, but with a deep, knowing appraisal. She was measuring this strange new woman. Before the biscuits were even out of the oven, a big, bearded man stomped in. "This her?" he grunted, jerking a thumb at Lily. Colton came in right behind him. "Yep, this is Lily. This is Jed, my foreman." Jed scratched his beard. "Don't look like much." Colton's eyes narrowed. "Didn't hire her to look like much." And through it all, Lily didn't say a word. She didn't flinch. She just kept working, flipping pancakes onto a plate like she hadn't heard a thing. That's when Jed looked at her with a flicker of something new in his eyes. Respect. Later that day, Colton took her on a tour of the ranch. It was a kingdom of work. Every fence post was straight, every tool was clean. "You said you grew up on a farm," he said. "I worked on one," she corrected him. "Never stayed in one place long enough to call it mine." He nodded. "Well, this one's mine. But Rosa runs the house, Jed runs the crew, and the land. The land mostly runs itself." As they walked, they came to a pasture where a young black colt was limping badly. Colton frowned. "Been favoring that leg since the last storm." Lily didn't hesitate. She slipped under the fence rail and approached the colt, her voice a low, soothing murmur. The horse's ears twitched, but it stood still. She ran a calm hand down its leg, her fingers probing gently. "Stone bruise," she said, her voice certain. "He'll be fine in a week." Colton just watched her. "You know horses," he stated. She looked up at him, her eyes holding his. "I know limping," she said. And in that moment, something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but understanding. A recognition of old wounds. That night, Rosa found Colton in the barn, checking the locks. "She's quiet," the old woman said. "So am I," Colton replied. Rosa's brow furrowed. "You're quiet because you've been hurt. She's quiet because she's hiding." Colton didn't deny it. "She's not here to hurt you, Colton," Rosa added softly. "But she's not just here for a roof over her head either." He knew that too. "You still want her to stay?" Rosa asked. Colton looked toward the main house, where a single light burned in the guest room window. "Yes," he said. Rosa nodded once. Then I will put a cross on her door, for protection. Colton shook his head. Don't. Let her decide if she wants one. Upstairs, Lily, or Grace, was doing something else for protection. She had the floorboard up again. She took one of the letters from the packet. She didn't read it. She knew the words by heart, the threats, the promises of pain. She just lit a match and held it to the corner of the paper. She watched it curl, turn black, and crumble into ash. She wasn't safe yet. But for the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't running. She was standing still, she was watching, and she was getting ready to fight. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Grace, she was still Lily to everyone here, worked from sunup to sundown. She was trying to build a new life, one callus at a time. She fed the chickens, mended the tack, helped Rosa in the kitchen. She didn't speak much, but she listened. She learned the sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle in the morning, the sharp ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the easy laughter of the ranch hands in the evening. Jed, the gruff foreman, started calling her the quiet one, but now it sounded like a name, not an insult. Rosa even trusted her with the sourdough starter, a living thing the old woman had kept alive for 17 years. It felt like being handed a heart. But Grace knew this was all a test. She was earning her place, moment by moment. She hadn't been given anything. Not yet. The real test came a week later. Colton rode in from a supply trip to town, his arm wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. A length of barbed wire had snapped and laid his forearm open. It wasn't deep, but it was ugly. Rosa took one look at it, threw her hands up, and declared her old eyes weren't steady enough for stitches. She pointed a bony finger at Grace. You. Fix him. Colton sat at the kitchen table without a word of protest, his jaw set, his sleeve rolled up. Grace's hands didn't even tremble as she cleaned the wound, her movements quick and efficient. He didn't flinch when she pushed the needle through his skin. The air in the kitchen was thick with the smell of antiseptic and something else. Something unspoken. You're good at this, he said, his voice a low rumble. I've patched up worse, she replied, her eyes focused on her work. Your own? He asked. She hesitated for just a second. Sometimes. He didn't push. He just watched her fingers, the way they moved with such certainty. When she was done, he reached up with his good hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. His knuckles were rough against her skin. You shouldn't have had to, he said softly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of regret. And that small, simple kindness almost broke her. That night, Grace didn't burn a letter. She read one. The handwriting was elegant, but the words were pure poison. You think you can hide behind a new name in some backwater territory? You think marrying some dirt-kicking fool will keep you safe? We remember you, Grace, and we always collect our debts. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. She fed the letter to the flames in her small fireplace, watching the threat turn to ash and smoke. She would not run, but she would not let this darkness touch Colton, or this place. The next morning, a letter was waiting for her, not a threatening one. This one was tucked into the feed ledger in the kitchen. It was addressed to Colton, but it was from a woman in Cheyenne. The handwriting was flowery, the words full of flattery. It even contained a photograph of a woman with lips painted too red and eyes that looked cold and hungry. Grace stared at it. He'd been writing to other women. Of course he had. Why would she be the only one? But then she saw the date. It was postmarked a month before her own letter had even been sent. He had chosen her over this woman. Why? The question echoed in her mind all day. Later, a young colt in the paddock spooked, rearing and kicking, its eyes wide with terror. Before Jed or any of the other hands could move, Grace was over the fence. She didn't run at it. She moved slowly, her arms out, her voice a low, calming hum. Easy now, easy, boy. No one's going to hurt you. The colt stopped its frantic dance, its sides heaving. It watched her, snorting. She never broke eye contact. She just kept talking, moving closer one slow step at a time until she could press her palm flat against its trembling neck. She gentled the animal in minutes, leading it back to the stable as if they were old friends. Jed just stood there, his mouth hanging open. "Damn," he whispered. Colton was leaning against the fence, his arms crossed. He hadn't said a word. But when she looked over at him, the hardness in his eyes had softened, and she felt something take root in her chest. Something small and stubborn she'd thought was dead for good. Hope. That evening, he found her on the porch, watching the sky bleed into darkness. He handed her a fresh-baked apple pie. "Rosa says this one's yours." She took it, surprised. "She must like me more than I thought." "She doesn't bake for just anyone," he said. He leaned against the porch post, and the silence that fell between them was comfortable now, not tense. Then, she finally asked the question that had been burning inside her all day. "Why me, Colton? Really?" There were other women. Better women. He was quiet for a long time, looking out at the mountains. "Their letters were full of what they wanted," he said finally. "Land, money, a husband. Your letter was about what you needed." She looked at him, confused. "What did I need?" He turned to look at her, his hazel eyes serious. "Open sky," he said. "I didn't want someone who was chasing things. I wanted someone who knew what it felt like to be caged." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. He saw her. He really, truly saw her. Not as Lily, the mail-order bride, but as a survivor. "Thank you," she whispered. "For the pie?" he asked, a small smile playing on his lips. "For seeing me?" she replied. Later, alone in her room, she opened the drawer where she kept the last unburned letter. It wasn't a letter at all. It was a photograph. A grainy, blurry picture of her face circled in red ink. On the back, 2 words were scrawled. "Still watching." She didn't burn this one. She couldn't. It was proof. She folded it carefully and put it back. She would tell Colton the truth, soon, because this place, this man, this feeling of hope, it was worth fighting for. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that a fight was coming. The note wasn't delivered by the postman. It was just there. Tucked inside a sack of oats, folded into a neat, sharp square. Grace found it while she was helping Rosa in the pantry. Her name wasn't on it. There was no address. Just 5 words, cut from a newspaper and glued to a piece of brown paper. "The house always wins." Her blood went cold. It was his phrase. Cassian Trent's favorite saying. It meant the game was rigged. It meant he was coming. She folded the note and slipped it into her apron pocket, her face a perfect, unreadable mask. She went right on measuring flour, but in her mind the walls were closing in. He'd found her. After all these months, all these miles, he had found her. How? Did he have someone watching her? Someone on the inside? The thought was terrifying. Anyone on this ranch could be an enemy. Jed, the other hands, even Rosa. That very evening, Colton came to her with a strange request. "There's a community supper at the church tonight," he said, leaning against her doorframe. "It's time the town saw us together." Grace froze. "You mean, it's time the town saw me?" He didn't deny it. "They're already whispering. Might as well give them something real to look at." Her first instinct was to say no, to hide. But the note in her pocket felt heavy. Hiding hadn't worked. Maybe it was time to do the opposite. "I don't have anything to wear," she said, her voice small. Just then, Rosa appeared behind Colton, a soft, gray wool dress draped over her arm. "You do now," the old woman said, her dark eyes seeing right through Grace's excuses. "It was mine, a long time ago. You'll fill it out better." Grace looked from Colton's expectant face to Rosa's knowing one. It felt like a trap. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a lifeline. The church hall was a sea of noise and lamplight. It smelled of baked bread and gossip. When Grace walked in on Colton's arm, the room didn't go silent, but the volume dropped. Every head turned. She kept her chin high, her hands folded in front of her, feeling like a prize pig at a county fair. Then she saw her, a woman in a silk dress the color of blood, surrounded by a gaggle of other women. Vivian Ashford, Colton's ex-fiancée. Vivian's voice was deliberately loud. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. I suppose that's one way to get a roof over your head. Find a lonely man with a big ranch." Grace felt Colton tense beside her, but she put a hand on his arm, stopping him. She turned to face Vivian, her eyes as cold and calm as a frozen lake. "Some cats know how to bite," Grace said, her voice quiet but clear. A few of the women nearby hid smiles behind their hands. Vivian's painted lips tightened into a thin, ugly line. "He has a habit of picking up strays," she hissed. "Let's hope you last longer than the others." Before Grace could reply, Colton stepped in front of her. "Vivian," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You still talking just to hear the sound of your own empty words?" Vivian looked like she'd been slapped. She turned on her heel and stormed away. They found a seat at a long table, but Grace couldn't relax. The note in her pocket felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. Then Colton leaned in close. "You don't have to prove anything to them," he whispered. "I know," she whispered back. "I have to prove it to myself." He looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. He slid it across the table to her. Inside was a ring. It was simple, white gold, etched with a pattern like stalks of wheat. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She wore it through drought and sickness. It's a survivor's ring." Grace's breath caught in her throat. "Colton, you don't even know who I am." "I know who you've been since you got here," he said firmly. "That's enough for me." Tears burned the back of her eyes. She pushed them down. Under the table, he took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. It felt like a promise. But as she sat there, the weight of the ring on her palm and the threat in her pocket, she knew she couldn't accept one without revealing the other. Later that night, she found him in the barn. She walked right up to him and held out her hand. In it was the crumpled note. He read it, his face hardening into a mask of stone. He didn't ask what it meant. He just looked at her. "I'll build better fences," he said. She shook her head. "It won't be enough." He then reached into his own pocket and pulled out a single, heavy iron key. "This is for the main house," he said, "and for my trust. It's yours." Grace looked at the key, then back at his face. "Before I take it," she said, her voice finally steady and strong, "I have something to tell you. My real name isn't Lily." The fire in the study cast long, dancing shadows on the walls as Grace told him everything. She sat across from him, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the logs. "My name," she began, her voice low but clear, "is Grace Harper." Colton didn't react. He just watched her, his hazel eyes intense, waiting. So she gave him the whole ugly story. The boarding house in Wichita that was really a front for a criminal enterprise. The owner, a man named Cassian Trent, who was more monster than man. The illegal gambling, the violence, the women trapped by debt and fear. "I saw him," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "beat a man nearly to death over a $10 debt. I saw him threaten a girl, just a child really, with a hot iron because she tried to run away." She took a shaky breath. "And one night I tried to help her. I tried to help her escape." Colton leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his focus entirely on her. "We got caught," she whispered, the memory still sharp as glass. "She got away. I didn't. He locked me in a storeroom for 2 days with no food and no water. He told me when he let me out, I'd be working for him in a very different way. That's when I ran. I took the first train heading west, changed my name, and answered your letter." When she finished, the silence returned, heavier than before. She couldn't read his expression. Was it disgust, pity, anger? "I thought he'd forget about me," she finally said, her voice cracking. "I thought I wasn't worth the trouble of chasing." Colton stood up and walked to the fireplace, turning his back to her. He stared into the flames for a long time. "How long ago?" he asked, his voice rough. 4 months. He turned to face her. "Why tell me now?" The answer was simple. "Because I don't want to start a life with a man based on a lie." He walked to his desk, picked up the crumpled note she'd given him. "The house always wins," he read aloud. She nodded. "That's his mark, his way of saying he owns you." Colton carefully folded the note and put it in his pocket. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not just a rancher, but something else. Something harder, something dangerous. "Then we'll have to be ready," he said. Grace looked up, shocked. You don't want me to leave?" "No," he said, his voice firm as bedrock. "I want you to stay, and I want you to be safe." She stood up and walked to him, her legs unsteady. She did something she hadn't dared to do before. She placed her hand flat against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "You should know," she said. "If you do this, if you stand with me, he'll come after you too. You'll be marked." Colton looked down at her hand, then back into her eyes. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. "I've been marked for a long time, Grace," he said. "I've just been waiting for a reason to fight back." And in that moment, Grace realized the biggest twist of all. She hadn't come to this quiet ranch to be saved by a simple farmer. She had been led here to a sleeping warrior, and she had just woken him up. The ranch transformed overnight. It was subtle at first. A new, heavy padlock on the tack room door. Fences that were already sturdy were reinforced with new wire. Jed and the other hands started carrying rifles on their saddlebags, even when just checking on the cattle. They didn't ask why. Their loyalty to Colton was absolute. His silence was an order they all understood. Something was coming. Rosa cornered Colton by the grain silo, her arms crossed, her dark eyes missing nothing. "You planning for a war?" she demanded. "Just making sure one doesn't start," he replied evasively. She wasn't fooled. That girl's past finally caught up to her, didn't it? He didn't have to answer. "Is she worth it, Colton?" He looked out over the vast expanse of his land, the land his father and grandfather had bled for. "She's more than worth it," he said. Rosa nodded, satisfied. "Then I'll load the shotgun." Grace, for her part, tried to act as if nothing had changed. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. But it was all an act. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. She never sat with her back to a window. She was a coiled spring, wound tight with tension. Then, on a trip into town for supplies, she saw him. He was standing outside the general store, dressed in a fine black coat, leaning on a silver-headed cane he didn't need. Cassian Trent. He was laughing, tipping his hat to a pair of ladies walking by, acting like he owned the whole damn town. His eyes swept the street, and then they found her. They locked onto her, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his handsome face. Recognition. Triumph. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't run. She forced herself to keep walking, to turn the corner, to put a building between them. Back at the ranch, she found Colton in the barn. "He's here," she said, her voice breathless. Colton's head snapped up, his eyes turning to flint. "Are you sure?" "He saw me," she said, "and he smiled." That night, the ranch house felt like a command center. Colton gathered Jed and Rosa in the study. He told them everything: who Cassian was, what he was capable of, and why he was here. When he finished, Jed leaned forward, his weathered face grim. "You want me to run him out of town, boss? It won't be pretty, but I can do it." "No," Colton said. "He's smart. He won't make a move until he's ready. We wait, but we watch. I want eyes on him every second." Grace watched these people, this small, loyal family, preparing to go to war for her. For a stranger they barely knew. She had never known this kind of loyalty. Later, Colton found her on the porch, staring up at the cold, distant stars. "Maybe you should leave," he said quietly. "Just for a few days. Go to the next county until this is over." She turned to him, her eyes blazing with a fire he'd never seen before. "No, I ran once. I spent months looking over my shoulder, sleeping with one eye open. I won't do it again. If he wants a fight, he can have one. But this time, I'm not the one who's going to end up running." He studied her face in the pale moonlight, seeing the fear. Yes, but seeing the steel underneath it. "You'd really face him?" "I have to," she said. He sat down beside her on the cold wooden steps. "Then I'll stand beside you." She reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Not beside me," she said. "With me." As they sat there, a team united by a common threat, the storm on the horizon suddenly felt a whole lot less frightening. Because this time, Grace wasn't facing it alone. Colton was in the saddle before the sun had even thought about rising. The leather of his saddle creaked in the pre-dawn stillness, a lonely, complaining sound. He hadn't slept. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he'd seen that triumphant smile on Cassian Trent's face, the smile Grace had described. A man like that, walking the streets of his town, breathing his air, it was a poison that needed to be purged. Jed met him at the main gate, a rifle slung over his shoulder. "You sure about going in alone, boss?" Colton pulled the cinch tight. "I'm not going in for a fight, not yet. I'm going in for a conversation." Jed spat into the dust. "Men like that don't have conversations. They make threats." Colton swung himself into the saddle. "I know. I need to find out what kind." He gave Jed a sharp nod and rode out, a solitary figure against the pale gray line of the coming dawn. Meanwhile, Grace was walking. She couldn't stay inside the house, couldn't sit still. She walked the fence line at the far end of the property, the frozen ground hard under her boots. She needed to feel something solid beneath her feet. When she reached the old apple orchard, the trees stood like stark bare skeletons against the sky. The silence was deep, unnerving. And then she saw him. He was standing just inside the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. Cassian. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just smiled that same awful smile. Her breath caught in her throat, but she held her ground. "You always did like hiding behind fences, Grace," he called, his voice smooth and soft, carrying easily in the still air. "You're not welcome here," she said, her own voice hard as iron. He chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "I go where I please. This is a free country. Or have you forgotten?" "What do you want, Cassian?" He stepped out of the shadows, revealing his fine suit, his polished shoes, completely out of place in this rustic setting. "The same thing I've always wanted. You." She took a step forward, her fists clenched at her sides. "Everything's changed. I'm not that scared girl from Wichita anymore." He laughed again. "No? Then why are your hands shaking?" She glanced down. He was right. Damn him. "I'm here to offer you a deal," he said, his voice turning businesslike. "A trade. You come back with me. No fuss, no fight. And your handsome cowboy here doesn't get hurt. No one on this little farm of his has to get hurt." Her blood ran cold. "He has nothing to do with this." "He has you," Cassian said simply. "That makes him everything to do with this." She took another step, her voice dropping to a low snarl. "If you touch him, I swear to God—" His smile turned to ice. "Careful, darling. You're starting to sound brave. It doesn't suit you." He tipped his hat in a mocking gesture. "You have until sundown to make your choice. Be smart." And then, as silently as he'd appeared, he melted back into the trees and was gone. In town, Colton found Cassian right where he'd expected, holding court on the porch of the saloon, a deck of cards flowing through his elegant fingers. He looked up as Colton approached, his eyes glinting with amusement. Ah, the noble rancher. Come to defend the maiden's honor? Colton ignored the jibe. He tied his horse and walked up the steps, stopping a few feet from Cassian. "I know who you are," Colton said, his voice flat and even. "I should hope so. What's your game, Hayes?" Cassian said, flipping over the Queen of Hearts. "I'm not playing one. I came to collect something that belongs to me." Colton's jaw tightened. "She doesn't belong to anyone." "She belonged to me," Cassian purred. Colton took a step closer, his hand hovering near the pistol on his hip. "You have until nightfall to be out of this county." Cassian just looked amused. "Or what? You'll challenge me to a duel?" "I won't be that polite," Colton said. The air between them crackled with unspoken violence. Finally, Cassian stood, pocketing his cards. "Tell Grace she has a choice. A life with me or a grave with you." Colton didn't flinch. "She already made her choice." Cassian tilted his head. "Then let's see how strong that choice is when she has to wash your blood off the floorboards." When Colton returned to the ranch, his face was a grim mask. He found Grace in the barn, not mending tack, but cleaning a rifle with steady, practiced hands. Rosa stood beside her, a box of cartridges open on a nearby barrel. "You saw him?" Grace said. It wasn't a question. "He threatened you," Colton replied. "And you. I know. He paid me a visit this morning, too." Colton's eyes blazed. "I won't let him touch you." "I know," she said, looking up from the rifle. "But this isn't just your fight, Colton. I'm not something to be protected. I'm a partner in this." She stood and walked to him, pressing her forehead against his chest. "I'm not running," she whispered. "Then we fight," he said, his arms wrapping around her. Outside, the sun began its slow descent, painting the clouds in shades of blood red and orange. Sundown was coming, and with it, the war Cassian Trent had been so eager to start. As dusk settled, the ranch became a fortress. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, a mournful, eerie sound. Every window in the main house was locked, every shutter bolted. Jed had moved the livestock into the main barn, closer to the house, and he and two other trusted hands were positioned on the roof, rifles at the ready. Rosa was upstairs, a shotgun resting across her lap as she watched the road from a darkened window. The entire ranch was holding its breath, waiting. In the parlor, Grace stood by the fireplace, the revolver Rosa had given her feeling heavy and cold in her hand. Her grip was steady. Her fear had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. Colton came to stand beside her. He pressed a worn pocket knife into her palm. "My father carried this in the war," he said, his voice low. "Said it was better than carrying fear." She looked down at the knife, then back up at him. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Then we've already won." A knock echoed through the silent house. It wasn't loud or frantic. It was calm, arrogant, certain. Colton moved to the door, his rifle held ready. Grace took up a position behind him, her own pistol raised. He pulled the door open a few inches. Cassian Trent stood on the porch, smiling as if he were paying a social call. Behind him stood two hired thugs, their hands resting on the pistols tucked into their belts. "I do hope I'm not intruding," Cassian said smoothly. You are, Colton replied, his voice flat. Cassian's eyes slid past Colton to Grace. There she is. You look well, darling. A life of rustic simplicity suits you. Don't call me that, she snapped. He sighed dramatically. Such hostility. I just came to talk. From the top of the stairs, Jed's voice boomed. We don't talk to snakes, we shoot 'em. Cassian chuckled. Ah, the loyal farmhand. You've built quite the little army, Hayes. Colton didn't move. Leave, now. Cassian's pleasant mask finally dropped. His eyes turned cold and hard. I don't leave debts unpaid, and she, he said, pointing a finger at Grace, owes me everything. Without me, she'd still be scrubbing floors for pennies. Grace stepped out from behind Colton, her eyes blazing. Everything I have because I left you. Because I chose to be more than one of your possessions. You were mine, he roared, his composure shattering. I gave you a place. You gave me a cage, she shot back. Enough, Colton yelled, raising his rifle. One of Cassian's thugs went for his gun, but before he could clear the holster, a shot exploded from the upstairs window. The man cried out and crumpled to the ground, clutching a shattered shoulder. Rosa. Chaos erupted. Colton fired at the second gunman, who dove for cover. Jed came charging down the stairs, roaring like a grizzly bear. Cassian, coward that he was, scrambled back towards his horse, pulling his own pistol. But Grace was ready. She stepped out onto the porch, took a steady two-handed grip on the revolver, and fired. The bullet whizzed past Cassian's head, tearing his hat from his head and leaving a bloody furrow along his ear. He froze, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. You won't escape this time, Cassian, she yelled, her voice ringing with power. He stared at her, panting, blood trickling down his face. You'd shoot me? I should have done it years ago, she said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Jed and another ranch hand tackled the second gunman, disarming him and dragging him inside. Colton kept his rifle aimed squarely at Cassian's chest. Get on your horse, Colton snarled, and pray the sheriff finds you before I do. Cassian, his arrogance finally gone, replaced by pure terror, scrambled onto his horse. He hauled his wounded man up behind him, and they galloped off into the darkness, swallowed by the night. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the howling wind. Then, Colton wrapped his arms around Grace, pulling her tight against him. You did it, he whispered into her hair. You stood your ground. She leaned against him, the adrenaline starting to fade, leaving a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I had to, she said, for the girl I used to be. The battle was over. The immediate threat was gone. But as she looked out into the dark, unforgiving night, she knew that a man like Cassian Trent didn't just give up. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. 2 weeks later, the snow came. It fell thick and silent, burying the world in a blanket of clean, quiet white. It covered the last of the footprints, the last of the bloodstains, as if the land itself was trying to forget the violence that had happened. But Grace would never forget. She stood at the kitchen window, watching the flakes drift down, and for the first time the silence didn't feel threatening. It felt peaceful. The ranch had healed, and so had she. Colton came in from the barn, stamping the snow from his boots. Sheriff's posse found them, he said, his voice calm. Holed up in a cabin over on Devil's Ridge. They're on their way to Wichita to stand trial. Grace felt a tremor go through her, a final release of a tension she'd carried for years. It was really over. Did he say anything? She asked. Colton shook his head. Didn't go quietly. That's all they said. She let out a long, slow breath. Of course he didn't. He came and stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. You okay? He asked softly. She leaned back against him, looking out at the pure, unmarked snow. I think, she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. I'm finally free. That afternoon, a wagon appeared, rolling slowly up the drive. It was Jed, and with him were half a dozen of their neighbors, their wagons laden with food and gifts. "Come to celebrate," Jed boomed. "Winter solstice and a victory." They brought pies and smoked hams, quilts and jars of preserves. An old woman pressed a small hand-knitted baby bonnet into Grace's hands. "For the future," she said with a wink. Grace blushed as Colton laughed beside her. The house filled with warmth and music and laughter. It felt like a home. It felt like her home. As the party wound down and the neighbors began to leave, Colton pulled her aside by the fire. He didn't get down on one knee. He didn't make a big speech. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out the small white gold ring etched with wheat stalks. He held it out to her on the palm of his calloused hand. Grace looked at the ring, then up into his steady, hopeful eyes. She didn't wait for him to ask. She picked up the ring herself and slid it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. "Are you sure?" she whispered. He smiled, a real, unguarded smile that lit up his whole face. "I was sure the day you stood up to Vivian Ashford in that church hall," he said. "I knew I'd found a fighter." Outside, the snow fell, burying the past deeper and deeper. But inside, by the warm fire, surrounded by people who had become her family, Grace Harper, the girl who had once run for her life, had finally found her way home. If you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected.